There's a lot of talk about steamy romance these days. Is it good? Is it positive? Is it the downfall of reading? Is it the downfall of society? I did a video myself about romantasy and why it is the way it is from kind of an objective writer point of view. Today I wanted to get a little more personal. I wanted to talk about my own personal experience writing steamy romance to market. The positive and the parts that were kind of uncomfortable for me for reasons that were unique to me. Well, probably not entirely unique to me, but let's say they were reasons that I didn't really think of when I started. This is not a judgment on romance. This is just a tale of a girl and her smut. And if you usually watch this channel with your kids, this might not be the video you want to watch with the kids. I'm going to try to keep it like, advertiser friendly, but we're going to be touching on some topics. So some basic context is that I am a fantasy author. I've always wanted to be a fantasy writer, pretty much as far back as I can remember. And I started my career in young adult fantasy romance. At that time, the steamy book trend was not even a thing yet in any genre. I mean, besides the usual, there's always been some steamy books, of course. It was the time of the young adult boom. But when that stopped working for me and I was kind of struggling financially, I had to research what could I do that would make me money, and that was what led me into steamy romance. I still was writing fantasy, but now I was adding steam, sometimes quite a lot of it. That started in 2016. By the time I got to 2022, I was experiencing absolutely intense burnout writing steamy romance. The afternoon sun just came in like crazy. All of a sudden, I swear the temperature in this room just shot up. And I'm sorry if the lighting gets a little flashy. I tried to hang up my curtain, but it's still kind of droopy. So yeah, in 2022, I was really struggling with the steamy books. Actually, probably even in 2021, I was starting to struggle in a big way. So I wanted to talk about that experience of what it was like writing those books and why I was struggling so badly by the end. I did pretty well with them for a time. I was generally making like $70,000 to $100,000 a year. So that was great, but I just couldn't sustain it. Like no matter how good the money was, and it was good and I miss it, but I literally could not do it anymore. Now that I've taken somewhat of a break, I actually am working on another steamy romance on the side, like a little short one, because I've taken like 2.5 years off. I mean, the books I've written since then have a little bit of technically a little spice, but it's a much more realistic context and pretty much fits within the parameters of a realistic relationship, which is extremely different from the steamy romance genre. So let's rewind all the way back to adolescence. I grew up in that weird kind of era where my childhood was pretty much like the AIDS panic, and by the time I got to adolescence and I started to feel the first stirrings of interest in boys and all of that, I turned to teen magazines for a lot of my information, and they were full of the panic. The default position was basically that boys were going to want things and you need to be careful because you could either get pregnant or you could die. And technically you could, because AIDS was pretty scary, but there was absolutely no discussion of why you as a woman would ever choose to do this. And I think that affected a lot of the women in my generation because we grew up in a time where it was particularly scary and uncertain. I remember going to the library when I was 20, and I was for kicks, I'm gonna get the latest book for teen girls, learning about your body and your feelings and all that. I'm gonna pick that up. I'm curious to see what the latest sort of book like this is like. And I was shocked to see how positive this book was. It was still giving be careful, use protection, make sure you really care about someone, reasonable advice. But there was an undercurrent of you will be doing things with boys someday and you should enjoy it. And you might not even need a boy. None of that was in anything when I was a kid. Also, it was before being gay was remotely accepted or out. like an open thing in any way. So I was just not really aware that you could have different gender or sexual identity except in the most vague way possible. And I knew that you would be shunned if you did. And on top of that, I was the kind of girl who was weird. When I was a teenager, I was very concerned for a time that I might be a lesbian, which I knew would mean that I would be shunned and I would have to come out. That was kind of all I knew, is that if you were gay at some point, if you wanted to like live your authentic life, you would have to tell everyone, and a bunch of people would reject you. So that was a horrifying thought. And my whole justification for worrying about this was because I liked to be boys when we played pretend games. I had really no understanding of any of that beyond that there was something a little off about my sense of gender. But I was also a very girly girl. I loved to wear dresses, as I still do. In a lot of ways, I was as girly as you can be. I liked fairly feminine hobbies, not like the most feminine, but you know, I liked to read. I wasn't very athletic. I was kind of a shy and gentle personality. I liked fashion. I definitely didn't feel like a boy. I just liked pretending to be a boy in pretend games, and I had crushes on boys. But they were generally, I mean, can you even call them boys? We have your Robin Hood Fox from the Disney Robin Hood. Shout out to everyone for whom that was your first crush. That was also me. There was also, speaking of Don Bluth, there was like the Hot Rat and the Secret of Nim. Furry phase ends there at like age 6, but it was there. Don Bluth foxes and rats. Then we had Nightcrawler from the X-Men comics. Jonathan the Zombie Master from the Xanth books. Jack Skellington. A lot of characters from JRPGs. Then we discover anime. There's a treasure trove in there. Plenty of boys to like. And, you know, there were a few real men in there somewhere. Eventually, we arrive at the ultimate real man, David Bowie. Now that I have the internet, you know, as of the last 30 years, I know that none of this was actually strange, that a lot of people had crushes on the Disney Robin Hood and Nightcrawler and even Jack Skellington, but at the time I had no idea. So I felt weird. I felt like there must be something about me that was wired weirdly. And it was a confusing time before we had words to define things better. Actually, I still am not sure how to define anything for myself. Except for one thing. At some point, I heard the word demisexual. Demisexual means that you're not really sexually attracted to someone until you've developed more of an emotional, personal, maybe intellectual connection with them. And that is the one gender or sexual identity that I'm like, that is definitely me. I am more attracted to personality than I am to any kind of immediate physical attraction. In fact, it's very rare for me to have physical attraction for anybody when I first meet them. But I will develop it over time, or like, if I get a good sense of someone's personality very quickly, then I might start to be attracted to them pretty quickly. Like when I worked at a used bookstore, sometimes a guy would put a stack on the counter and I would notice that like, he's reading a fantasy novel and he's also reading about the history of labor unions. That's kind of a hot combination. And then I would kind of register the guy himself. And if he was like dressed well, then it was kind of like, second point. And then I'd kind of register like his actual face. And if it was like remotely within the realm of what I found attractive, then my brain would be like, ding, hot boy. So it can happen quickly, but you gotta have a hot stack of books and a good outfit to get me quickly. And beyond that, I just think of myself as being mostly female and mostly straight, but not entirely. A lot of times all of this feels kind of like I'm just playing a part. Like I'm a girl. Okay, fine. I guess that's my part in this play that is life, this go around, and I'm going to play it well. If I was reborn tomorrow as a guy, I would easily be like, okay, we'll do the guy thing. I just hope I would be a well-dressed man. It's getting increasingly rare for anyone to be well-dressed anymore. Okay, so getting back to the whole romance novel thing, the main point here is that I am not attracted to physical bodies as much as I am attracted to emotions and minds. And I've also just never been a very charged up person to begin with. So when I thought about writing steamy romance, my first thought is, this is going to be hard because I've never really thought about any of this before. And I barely even know, like, where to even begin. But I do have a Scorpio moon, which means if I'm going to think about it, I don't want anything boring. I want to go straight to something psychologically intense. So I started researching romance and I read a fair number of steamy romances, and very quickly I thought, okay, I can do this. It's actually kind of like writing a fight scene. You're just kind of figuring out like this dynamic between two physical bodies, and you want to kind of have like some kind of emotional arc that gets resolved within the scene. At least that's how I decided to approach it. I didn't want any of the spicy scenes to feel really unnecessary to the plot. I wanted them to always have like a little emotional arc, just like you would have with a fight scene. There should always be a point to it. No matter how many of them are included, they should always be advancing something deeper with the couple or their relationship. So I started with the Cursed Soul trilogy, but that was still kind of like a baby steps spicy book because it was set in my fantasy world and I still didn't really understand steamy romance when I wrote it. But after I wrote that one, that was when I really moved into steamy romance conclusively for some years. And I started with steamy fairy tales. I found fairy tales a very easy entry point because the situations in fairy tales have a very what would you call that? They have like these certain patterns, and there's often somewhat of a erotic undertone to them. They often have like some kind of weird relationship between like princess and a prince, or a lot of curses and marrying monsters and things that appear in paranormal and fantasy romance novels, but they're all in this sort of almost, I want to say, surreal, a little larger than life maybe would be a better word, fairy tale land. I had a lot of fun writing those, but they also felt like a little bit of a dead end. Like I felt a little stuck in the fairy tale space and I wanted to branch out. I didn't think I could just keep writing like fairy tales for the rest of my life. So then I moved into more like longer paranormal romance. They had a lot of the usual tropes, fae, wolf shifters, a lot of your typical paranormal creatures. So when I started writing in more of the usual like paranormal romance zone, that was when I really started being in the romance communities, trying to market myself. And when I first started writing the fairy tales, honestly, I was having a fantastic time with it. It kind of felt therapeutic to me because I had had sort of this trauma associated with sexuality from childhood, I think. That thinking of it as something that was like dangerous and bad, and writing the fairy tales kind of helped me to get past that and think for the first time about like, what do I really like? What do I find sexy? And I was under a pen name. Nobody knew who I was at the time, so I could really just play around, write whatever. Nobody would know. It was very freeing. The books did really well. And I feel like all this was actually really good for me. And it's one reason why I will always defend women reading romance novels, because, which some people will say that women reading steamy romance novels is just kind of toxic. And there's a lot of different reasons people complain about it. But my personal experience is that it was just freeing. I was not actually looking. That sometimes I did read books with sort of toxic men, definitely toxic relationship dynamics at times, and it just helped me to get past the messages I had heard all my life about how all of this was dangerous and bad, and you were a bad girl if you were into it, and you were going to get yourself in trouble. That had stuck with me for too long, so really it improved my relationship and just helped me to be more relaxed as like a flesh and blood being to read romance novels. And I suspect that a lot of women grew up with similar messaging and might have had similar experiences with romance novels. But then when I was writing paranormal romance, not just the fairy tales, I was kind of moving into a more of a broad pool of marketing and just being in like deep in the romance community, or at least trying to break into being deep in the romance community. And that was when I started to feel extremely out of place, especially as these romance novels were getting to be more mainstream, more popular. The fans were increasingly talking more openly about like what they wanted, what they found hot, posting a lot of artwork. Like I had a personal Facebook group. Like people would post like hot men to my own Facebook group. And my reaction would often be like, ugh. Like I am just not attracted to like muscular, tattooed, bearded men. Like it's just too much. It's too much masculinity for me. I want my David Bowie. There were no David Bowies to be found in the romance community. There are not a lot of like wafy little weirdos. I mean, they are out there, but they're not like the predominant mood of the romance community. So I was floating around. I felt like I had kind of eventually stumbled into a party in which I absolutely did not belong. Kind of like an endless bachelorette party where someone has hired strippers and you're the one sitting there being like, I don't like this and I want to go home. So I'm trying to market this book, and I was doing like, it was getting harder to advertise with like Amazon ads and Facebook ads and somewhat more hands-off ways of advertising. You kind of had to get in there more than you did in the beginning. So I was having to prepare like a lot of graphics. Like you'd want your hot graphics with your guy with his chest, and I was having to scroll through a bunch of pictures of chest shirtless men on Canva and such. And I think that was where I hit the point where I just couldn't do it anymore. And I started to feel like, this kind of feels like I am going against my own sexual preferences is how this feels. Like this to me feels like this is probably how like gay people feel when they're trying to pass for a long time and they deep down know like, mm-mm. And it was weird because I am mostly attracted to men. So in theory, I didn't even put together at first like that I would feel this way. But I realized that my tastes in men were very different to the point where I was just actively turned off by what was popular. And I really need that like emotional and intellectual connection in my romance novels, that even when I'm writing a very short and steamy book, I try to have like an emotional connection between the characters. And a lot of women do like that. I'm certainly not alone in that, but not all of them. And a lot of them are definitely, you know, thirsting for a different type of man than me. That is the predominant mood. I've almost never picked up a book that just had like a guy's bare chest on it. Just seeing it makes me think this book is not for me. Now, if you have like a illustrated cover with like some pale sorcerer guy who's dressed well and thoroughly like cover that boy up, then I feel a little more comfortable. But also when I'm reading, I kind of want like a realistic man. Like there's a certain level of dialogue that I will see out there that a lot of readers really love, where the man is just like, I am so devoted to you. You are my moon and stars, and I would kill anyone who looks at you. And I'm not really into that either. I'm more into the guy who just kind of talks like a really great real guy, which I have a hard time imagining that any real man talks to anybody like that. Maybe it's just the men I hang out with. There's probably some really intense guy somewhere who does talk like that, but I'm like more like the fun, funny banter. And again, I'm not alone in this. If you look around in romance, clearly there are plenty of people who like some good banter, some different types of guys. But you will have somewhat of a harder road, particularly in marketing, because the algorithm is always going to go with what's most popular and just kind of the easiest sell, path of least resistance, shall we say. And that was where I just cracked. I could not do that kind of marketing anymore. Like I just physically could not do it. My entire mind and emotions started rebelling completely against doing this kind of marketing. I could not look at another shirtless man if you paid me $20 per chest. And that was when I I had to take a long break from writing those kind of stories. So there's not really any particular point or conclusion to this video, except to say that if you are the kind of woman who is more somewhere on the spectrum of David Bowie to Jack Skellington as being your ideal man, I see you, girl. And you know, you're not alone. If you ever feel like you just don't quite fit into the most typical romance reader vibe, I think there are actually a lot of us. It's just that we are not the easiest path for the algorithm to flow to. So you're not alone. I guess that's the main point. You're not alone. And if you try to write romance novels and you end up feeling really weird about it, you're not alone in that either. So now that I've had kind of a long break from it all, I think that I probably will continue to write now and then a steamy romance, because I've finally gotten to the point where it starts to sound fun again. But in getting to that point, that was what sort of got me thinking about, like, oh wow, I really couldn't write these for a while. Like, everything just went so wrong for me for a while. Like, what was that? So if you like romance, but sometimes you struggle to feel like you fit in the romance community, drop me a comment, just say hey. And if you're new here, my name is Lydia Foxglove, and I am a fantasy author. And on this channel, I talk about all sorts of things to do with the creative life, the emotional, the practical, the financial, and writing and books in particular. If that sounds good to you, feel free to subscribe and stick around. And if you'd like more from me, I have YouTube memberships turned on, and also my Substack and Patreon members. I have free content on both if you want to sign up for that. And all my members get 2 extra videos a month, voted on by you guys.
How could you choose between Brian Ferry and David Bowie? They're gods.
Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.